Okay, welcome to the Oneida Community Mansion House. We're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. We're just going to wait for some people to trickle in. But in the meantime, if you want, you can put in where you're tuning in from in the Q&A, and we'll see how far our reach is today. I'll give it a couple minutes, and then we'll get started. That's right. You're there over here, so just keep walking afterwards to find your stuff. My name is Christine. So you probably just think like you should be another lecture or something. No, it's okay. My area is yesterday for us last year. Exactly. Internet unlike a lot of these okay, I think we'll get started. So again, welcome to the Oneida Community Mansion House. My name is Tom Geiler. Thank you for attending this event with Ashley Hopkins-Benton of the New York State Museum entitled Dress Reform and Women's Rights, the Intersection of Women's Suffrage, the Bloomer Costume, and the Oneida Community. So we're really happy to have Ashley here this evening. My name is Tom Geiler. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs here at the Mansion House. I want to thank you all for tuning in wherever you may be or coming out to the Mansion House on a really beautiful day. Here's the schedule for the evening. We're going to have some brief announcements. I'll kind of set the scene. Then Ashley will give her lovely talk, and then we'll have some Q&A from both you folks here in the audience, but also online as well. The Zoom will be recorded, and everyone in person and online will get a copy of the recording. And next is that just a few housekeeping measures. One is that for folks on Zoom, the presenters will be visible, so that will be sort of me back in mission control, Ashley with her laptop, as well as our in-house iPad. But all the attendees will not be visible and will not be on camera nor on audio. So you can feel free to cook dinner, eat dinner, do your laundry, whatever you want to do while you listen to Ashley. If there are any issues, if you're having some issues on the tech end, please just put them in the Q&A. I'll be sort of monitoring that as well. Questions will be answered at the end, so you can feel free to put them in, or if there's a slide in particular that you want to go back to, just make sure you note that. I can do that as well. And also for folks that may want to close captioning, there's a button at the bottom of your Zoom window that you can enable the closed captioning. And if you're in person, just some brief housekeeping things. If you're looking for a restroom, out this door and to your right or your left, you'll find a restroom. And in the very unlikely event of an emergency, the closest emergency exit is either directly out the door and through the next door straight ahead, or back the way you came through the front door. Before we get started, if you're new to the Mansion House, it's your first time here, or you haven't been here in a long time, we just want to remind you of what the Mansion House is today. We are a museum and national historic landmark. that interprets and preserves the history and story of the Oneida community, Oneida Limited, and its legacies felt today. We're also an event space for things like what you're here for today, lectures. We also do corporate retreats, family gatherings, concerts, and performing arts throughout the building. As Ashley will know tonight, and some of you know already, it's a historic inn where we have 14 guest rooms that blend sort of history, historic charm with modern amenities. So if you're interested in your next getaway, if you're not from around here, please do consider the Mansion House. And finally, and most importantly, we are a residence. We've been a residence since 1862 and still have about 30 or so people that live here and call the Mansion House home. If you're interested in connecting with us more, we've got a really big slate of events here in the months of March and April. Coming up on March 23rd, we're going to be holding a concert at 3 p.m. by Monk Row in the Five Families Ensemble. That's gonna be a great performance. On Thursday, March 27th at 6 p.m., right back here in this room, we're gonna continue our Women's History Month celebration with a lecture by me about 3 women, all named Harriet, who had very different experiences in the Oneida community. And that will also be a hybrid event as well, so feel free to sign up. On Friday, April 11th, we'll be holding a new event where it's completely virtual called Relive the Moment, Identifying Oneida Limited Photos. So myself and our Curator of Collections, Emily Stegner, are going to be teaching you about our new exhibit app and the ways you can go through it and identify some of the pictures, people in the Oneida Limited pictures from about the 1950s to the 1990s. On Sunday, April 13th, we're going to be closing out this section of our music series with Brian Quinn, who is a local guy, but you may know him from The Voice, and it'll be 3 p.m. at the Big Hall. And on April 25th, we will be having a factory tour. So we'll be starting here at the Mansion House, and then with a tour of our new Oneida Limited exhibit, followed by a tour of Liberty Tabletop, which is the only American-made silverware manufacturer in America. And you can see how a spoon is made from coil to finished object. Please see our website for more information about these events. If you're interested in getting more involved, I hope you are, please consider becoming a member. All of these programs that I've talked about are all discounted to members. So it's just one of the many perks of membership. And most importantly, we'd love for you to subscribe to our e-newsletter where you can be the first to hear about upcoming events and great history tidbits and all that's going on here at the Mansion House. So, without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker tonight. We are celebrating Women's History Month, which is March, but as we all know, every month is Women's History Month. So we're always doing women's centric programs here because in many ways, the story of the OC is the story of women. So Ashley Hopkins-Benton is the Senior Historian and Curator of Social History at the New York State Museum. She received a BA in Studio Art and Art Education at SUNY Potsdam and an MA in History and Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program. Her research focuses primarily on women's history, especially the history of the fight of women's rights, LGBTQ+ history, immigration, and religion, as well as the collections areas of sculpture, toys, glassware, and ceramics. That sounds like a blast. She is currently working on projects aimed around Albany's LGBTQ+ community and specifically the Pride Center of the Capital Region. She's also working to build the LGBTQ+ collection and representation at the New York State Museum and has been collecting oral histories from community members as well. So fantastic projects. Her major publications include Enterprising Waters, the History and Art of New York's Erie Canal, and this lovely tome, Votes for Women, celebrating New York's suffrage centennial, which we do have copies available if you're interested in purchasing them. Ashley would be more than happy to put her signature on them for you for your next gift or for your next read. So we're very happy to welcome Ashley to the Mansion House. So take it away.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. The last time I was here, I was actually supporting a colleague. Well, she did a lecture 14 years ago, so it's been too long. Today's talk is going to talk about the dress reform movement, but specifically how women's rights reformers in the 19th century interacted with the dress reform movement and where some of their inspirations came from, including here at the Oneida Community. So in order to talk about dress reform, first we have to look at what fashionable dress looked like in the 1840s and 50s. We can see from the fashion plates that dresses that swept the floor, or as the newspapers pointed out, swept the ground, and all of the garbage that was there were the fashion. You can barely see the tips of the women's feet. Underneath them, they wore a number of layers, including a corset, not necessarily tight-laced as we think of today, but certainly a structure that was underneath all of these clothing. And that rounded shape of the skirt that you see was created by many layers of petticoats, which, although perhaps softer than the corset, could get very heavy. And by the 1850s, you can see on the bottom right, the petticoat suspender. People are starting to think about all of this weight that's on women from these petticoats and how they can help deal with those. So they may involve things like petticoat suspenders. Ultimately, they developed into the hooped crinolines that you start to see in the 1860s. So a lot of weight, a lot of layers, very cumbersome. Also, before we get into women's rights reformers and how they took on dress reform, we have to talk about what was going on in the women's rights movement at this time. So one of the big issues in New York State especially was that of married women's property rights. Before the law was passed in 1848, women's property, even that which she brought into a marriage, became the property of her husband. And if he was a drunkard, if he wasted all the money, if she couldn't afford to feed her children, she had no recourse. So this was the subject of a lot of organizing for many years. Some of it headed up by Ernestine Rose, who we see here, who was an immigrant from Poland. The first petition to the New York State legislature that she submitted on this issue was in 1836. And she went around speaking to groups of people all over the state and actually all over the Northeast. Before it was a major point of discussion at the 1846 New York State Constitutional Convention, and ultimately it passed in April of 1848. New York State was the first to pass such a law. And then, of course, in 1848, we have the Seneca Falls Convention, the Women's Rights Convention, held July 19th and 20th in Seneca Falls. The planners and attendees of this convention were interested in a broad swath of women's rights issues. It was not just about the right to vote. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the planners, it was her idea that the right to vote be included, and she faced a lot of pressure against her on that idea. People thought that she would make the movement look ridiculous. But as I said, they were interested in broad reforms. Repression in the government, in the home, in the professions, in education, and the church. And they laid all of these ideas out in the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. In the document, they replaced the colonists' grievances with the king with the ways in which women were repressed all around the United States. And dress directly impacted the rights that they were talking about in the Declaration of Sentiments, especially access to the professions. In the document, they write, "He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life." And then as it pertained to broader reform, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote to Lucretia Mott, "Depend upon it, Lucretia, that women can never develop in her present drapery." So they were in need of a solution. They didn't have one yet in 1848. We also need to talk about what Seneca Falls was like in 1848. So on the left, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as I mentioned, one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, the drafter of the Declaration of Sentiments. And I love this photo of her taken around the time of the convention because you can tell that she is a tired mom. And she is feeling very isolated in Seneca Falls. She doesn't get to get out of the house very much. She doesn't have help. And her first two boys were known as very raucous and rowdy. So you can tell her tiredness. Seneca Falls was a community, and the surrounding area was a community of reform-minded women. So you had Quakers who lived nearby. It was at the home of Quaker friends that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, also a Quaker who was visiting, decided to host the Seneca Falls Convention. You have abolitionists, the temperance movement, and visits by a lot of influential thinkers and reformers, Lucretia Mott, as well as Frederick Douglass, who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. And on the right, in 1849, we see the newspaper The Lily, and this is the first newspaper for women. It was the journal of the Seneca Falls Ladies Temperance Society, and eventually grew to include broader reform articles on women's rights. Amelia Bloomer was the editor until about 1854, when she sold it to Mary Birdsall, and she remained a contributing editor. And there's conflicting information about when exactly the newspaper finished, but it ran for over a decade. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also published in The Lily under the pseudonym Sunflower. So into this community steps Elizabeth Smith Miller. She is the daughter of abolitionist Gerrit Smith and cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And by all accounts, she's the first in the women's rights circle to start wearing a reform costume. So you see a shorter skirt, you see pants on the bottom. We'll see a couple of different versions in the images of what type of pants they were, whether they were open on the bottom or kind of drawn together. You can see she's got open ones. In Elizabeth Cady Stanton's memoirs, she says, "To see my cousin, Elizabeth Smith Miller, with a lamp in one hand and a baby in the other, walk upstairs with ease and grace, while in flowing robes I pulled myself up with difficulty, lamp and baby out of the question, readily convinced me that there was sore need of reform in women's dress, and I promptly donned a similar attire. What incredible freedom I enjoyed for 2 years. Like a captive set free from his ball and chain, I was always ready for a brisk walk through sleet and snow and rain, to climb a mountain, jump over a fence, work in the garden, and in fact, for any necessary locomotion." And I'll talk a little bit about the downfall of reform dress amongst women's rights reformers, but Elizabeth Smith Miller wore it for amongst the longest. She stayed in the bloomer costume for 7 years. So then we get to, how did other women know about it? It was not just word of mouth in Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton saw Elizabeth Smith Miller wearing it. She introduced her to Amelia Bloomer, and Bloomer decided to print the reform dress, or the new costume as she first called it, in the Lily in July of 1851, the image that you see on the far left. This resulted in a tremendous influx of letters and interest from her readers. They wanted to see her in the reform dress because she said that she wore it. So later in September of 1851, she published an image of herself wearing it. And then you can see that she even had her daguerreotype taken in the reform dress. And because of that, that is why it becomes known as the Bloomer costume, even though Amelia Bloomer is really not the one to introduce it to the community. So where did it come from? There are several theories, and the first of them starts here at the Oneida Community. John Humphrey Noyes, leader of the Oneida Community, declared, "Women's dress is a standing lie. It claims that she is not a two-legged animal, but something like a churn standing on casters." Soon after setting up life here in Oneida, women in the community adopted a shorter dress over pants, as well as cutting their hair into a shorter style. And given the expectation of being involved in community life and working in various professions, this was a very practical move. There are a number of documented responses in newspapers where community members are asked about their costume, how it's put together, and they reply with details down to the underwear, what they wore underneath it, into the 1860s. In 1866, when Oneida Community women had worn this dress for 18 years, they recalled, "This dress was adopted as a matter of convenience rather than taste. It was in the beginning of our enterprise at Oneida when the women were ambitious to break up effeminacy and took part in many kinds of industry, usually considered masculine. They wanted an appropriate dress and made it by simply cutting off the dresses they had and making pantalettes to them." And they go on to say, and we'll see this echoed later, "We do not claim, however, to represent entirely the artistic standard. We have found it healthy for us so far to be contented with convenience and let the matter of taste wait until women's weakness in that direction is out of danger. Whenever we shall feel at liberty to give particular attention to dress on the score of beauty, we shall make changes, no doubt. To be really beautiful, the contour of the dress should approximate the form, a rule which the long dress sadly ignores, and which our present short dress does not fulfill. So they admit maybe this is not the most attractive. And as I said, we'll hear that echoed later by others as well. Another possible inspiration is Haudenosaunee women. And we know that they were wearing slightly shorter dresses over loose pants. We know that a lot of leaders in the women's rights reform movement, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Joslyn Gage, were friends with many Haudenosaunee women. They spent time in their communities, and they were deeply inspired by the way that they lived, the way that their society was set up. It was a matrilineal society. Women had a lot more say in governance and in property, and the women's rights reformers really envied that. So perhaps looking to the way that they dressed was also an inspiration. On the right is a much later satirical cartoon, but it's talking about the fact that white women talked about the savagery of the Native Americans, but in fact, they had a much higher standard for their rights, their governance, their ownership of property. And the water cure movement is a third possibility. They refer to this kind of costume with a shorter dress and pants in a number of different ways. They called it the short dress, the shorts, the Turkish dress, the American costume, and the reform dress. Women in the water cure movement felt that standard dress, quote, caused our ladies to totter and hobble along like a cripple or a fettered animal. And in this movement, they really emphasized the importance of movement and exercise. So again, it is only practical to have a dress that you can do those activities in. So here we have a comparison again. On the left, fashionable dress for the 1850s, again, sweeping on the floor, many, many heavy layers. And on the right, the most complete known example of a bloomer costume in the collection of the Cortland Historical Society. As I said, when Amelia Bloomer published in her newspaper, there was a lot of interest across the country. There was this pent-up interest of women to get out and do things, to be able to garden, to be able to do housework, to be able to go for a walk. And so it made a big splash pretty quickly, and it was adopted by a fair number of people. There are multiple counts of women saying, I donned the reform dress or the bloomer costume for the first time, and I got up and I walked 5 miles, I walked 10 miles. They all say the same thing. So it was kind of a revelation to have this freedom of movement out in public. The known example from Cortland was signed M.M. Carpenter for Mervia Carpenter from Homer, New York. So a very local example as well. The bloomer appeared in popular places. So it appeared in a number of different pieces of sheet music. These are 2 from the New York State Museum or New York State Library collection. But there are a number of other ones that I've seen as well. And there was this idea that newspapers had ridiculed women's fashionable dress, how impractical it was. So at first there was this acceptance of it. But unfortunately, very soon that acceptance turned to ridicule. These are 2 cartoons that are making fun of, mocking the reform dress. You can see in both of them that the women are shown in a much, much shorter skirt than was actually worn by all of the real women that we've seen depicted in bloomer costumes. Most descriptions of how to make a bloomer costume by women of the period, from the Oneida Community, from the women's rights movement, all talk about a skirt that falls a couple inches below the knee. And you can see certainly these women depicted here are not dressed that way. These cartoons are speaking to the idea that changing women's dress is intertwined with all of the other rights that these women are asking for, and that they will completely upend society. So the reform dress became a symbol of what was threatening about feminism. Gender role equity, women making decisions independent of men, In the upper left, you see a woman who has left her husband to slave over the stove and to watch the children, who are all very unhappy, while she goes out to a suffrage meeting. And then on the right, you see a number of women who are out on the street, smoking, talking politics, probably going off to the polls as well. So they're tying together this clothing with all of these things that they don't want to happen in the world. Now, there were some people who pointed out the irony that they were complaining about fashionable women's dress, and now the press was complaining when women tried to find a solution to dress in a way that was more practical. And at first, women's rights reformers railed against these criticisms. In the Lily in July of 1852, they wrote, "Having experienced the blessings of freedom, we cannot rivet the chains upon ourselves again, even to gain the goodwill or to avoid the frowns of slavish conservatism." But for many, that didn't last for very long. Bloomer costumes were seen by women's rights reformers as taking attention away from the issues of women's rights. And by the mid-1850s, there is a much stronger focus on gaining the right to vote. That is seen as the most important first step, and then we can get the other things that we're talking about after that. Susan B. Anthony, whose dress you can see here, a fashionable dress from the 1870s that she wore later, said, "The attention of my audience was fixed upon my clothes instead of words." And I feel like that's a quote that any modern woman can totally associate with. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that women's rights reformers, quote, "soon found that the physical freedom enjoyed did not compensate for the persistent persecution and petty annoyances suffered at every turn. To be rudely gazed at in public and private, to be conscious subjects of criticism, and to be followed by crowds of boys in the street were all, to the last degree, exasperating." There is no doubt wearing the bloomer costume as a women's rights reformer out in the world was a difficult thing to do. On February 9th, 1854, Susan B. Anthony wrote to fellow reformer Lucy Stone about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And at the time, she was headed to Albany to present a speech to the New York State Legislature. She wrote, "Her petticoats have assumed their former length, and her wardrobe cleared of every short skirt. I am sorry, but I feel a great deal of sympathy for her. She stood all alone, without father, mother, sister, brother, or husband. She imagines now that she will be less persecuted by them all, but I tell her that the dress is not a matter of trouble to them. Her altruisms will become more obvious to them. Everyone who drops the dress makes the task a harder one for the few left." So Stanton personally had a fair amount of family support for a lot of the reforms that she was advocating for. In fact, her husband was a reformer deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. So he understood where she was coming from on a lot of fronts. He was not okay with the bloomer costume, nor was her father. And that is why Anthony says that she is standing alone. Even Elizabeth Smith Miller, after 7 years, dropped the reform dress, in part for appearances. And this is where I say, we'll reflect back on what the women of the Oneida Community were saying. She said, "I wore the short dress and trousers for many years, my husband being at all times and in all places my staunch supporter. The dress looked tolerably well in standing and walking, but in sitting, a more awkward, uncouth effect could hardly be imagined. So by degrees, I lost sight of the great advantages of my dress, its lightness and cleanliness on the streets. It's allowing me to carry my babies up and down the stairs with perfect ease and safety, and its beautiful harmony with sanitary laws. Consequently, the skirt was lengthened several inches and the trousers abandoned. As months passed, I proceeded in this retrograde movement until after a period of some 7 years, I quite fell from grace and found myself again in the bounds of the old swaddling clothes, a victim to my love of beauty. All hail the day when we shall have a reasonable and beautiful dress that shall encourage exercises on the road and in the field, that shall leave us free to use our limbs, that shall help us and not hinder our perfect development." So women's rights reformers, even when they stopped wearing it for the time, often had a hope that it would come back eventually, that they could get over this first hurdle, gain their rights in other arenas, and eventually get back to more practical dress. Susan B. Anthony wrote to Gerrit Smith on December 25th, 1855, "I can see no business avocation in which women in her present dress can possibly earn equal wages with man. And I feel that it is folly that we make this demand until we adapt our dress to our work. I every day feel more keenly the terrible bondage of these long skirts. I own that the want of moral courage caused me to return to them. So the takeaway from all of this for women's rights reformers was the need to focus on what they saw as the core issues first, and deal with things that were uncomfortable, that were not helpful to their lives in general, for the greater cause. Meanwhile, not all women immediately dropped the reform dress. There were other reformers who felt that the women's rights reformers had actually hurt their cause. They believed that there were negative views of women's suffrage, and those reflected poorly on the reform dress. So dress reform work continued through the Dress Reform Association into the 1870s. The Civil was one of the main newspapers that held this movement together. It was edited by Lydia Sayer Hasbrook in Middletown, New York. And they continued to talk about the importance of movement and the health of wearing lighter and shorter clothing. And then we have women like Dr. Mary Walker, who continued because it was how she was comfortable and what best suited her profession. She was a surgeon in the Civil War. Dr. Mary Walker wore bloomers for many years, and as you can see on the left, very stylish bloomers. She was definitely a person who was interested and aware of how she presented herself to the world, and took a lot of thought and concern into what she was wearing and how it was trimmed and how she represented herself. Ultimately, she switched over to wearing a full men's style suit, sometimes with top hat. She was arrested on multiple occasions for wearing pants. In 1880, the Vineland Independent reported, quote, "Dr. Mary Walker may be eccentric, but she is no fool. On election day, she offered her vote in Oswego, and it was refused on account of her sex. A bystander remarked that if Mary was allowed to vote, they might as well dress up all their women folks in men's clothes and bring them down to vote them. To which Mary indignantly replied, I don't wear men's clothes, I wear my own clothes." So clearly she has a comfort in the things that she was wearing. These are what makes her feel her. In the preface to her first book, Hit, in 1871, the first thank you was to her family. The second one was to the practical dress reformers. And she said, "The truest friends of humanity who have done more for the universal elevation of women in the past dozen years than all others combined. You who have lived the precepts and principles that others have only talked, who have been so consistent in your ideas of the equality of the sexes by dressing in a manner to fit you for the duties of a noble and useful life. You who have written and spoken and have been living martyrs to the all-important principles involved in a thoroughly hygienic dress, and thus given to the world an indisputable proof of your unflinching integrity. To you, in a word, who are the greatest philanthropists of the age, this second dedication is made." So you can see how important this was to her and what it meant, that there were still women who were upkeeping this ideal and willing to deal with the negative effects. She faced other negative effects as well. The insults that were thrown at women's rights reformers in the early days of their wearing bloomers did not stop. So the suffrage movement saw a lot of criticism into the 20th century that the women were trying to take over men's roles, that they wanted to be men, that they were not interested in ever having children or taking care of the home at all. And so in the 20th century, they had to fight against this idea that getting the vote meant upending society altogether. They responded with a push to present the movement in ways that centered them as wives and mothers and homemakers who also wanted the vote and wanted the vote to be able to better make decisions for all of these roles. As a result, Dr. Mary Walker, who was also a staunch supporter of suffrage, was pushed out of the movement. She was left out of the written histories. She was left out of important meetings. She was not allowed to have a place at the forefront, as she should have, as a woman who really stepped out and lived the life that she wanted to and did the things that she felt she could. So that brings us to the end, and I leave you with me and bloomers. And I show this for a couple of reasons. I do sometimes do talks where I wear this. I'm sorry I couldn't do that today. But you can see that the skirt is long, and one of the biggest questions I get when I do wear this in public is, well, that's really long. It's not going to help you at all. But in fact, it is short enough that you can walk up the stairs without having to hike up your skirt. It makes a major difference. And I've worn both this and traditional 1850s dress, much easier to move in. And I'll also say that I was having my Elizabeth Cady Stanton moment when I was wearing this in this picture, where my son came up and decided he needed to be part of this conversation. So any questions? Yes.
Any information on like the expense of making different kinds of dresses? Did the reformers comment on like using less fabric or economy or something like that? I don't really so, but you know, the full length costumes look absolutely voluminous, and I have read some references to people using like 30 yards of ribbon, things like that. So I don't know if that came up in discussion or in any primary sources.
Yes, so the question for those online was if there was noted difference about the expense of making the garments reform dress versus traditional dress or fashionable dress. For most of the women's rights reformers who I've read about adopting the bloomer costume, they are typically working with clothes they already have. So they are taking dresses they have, they are chopping them off at the bottom, and they're using that bottom piece to create the bottom of the pantalettes. Then they're using other just plain fabric for the rest of the pantalettes. So if you were to lift the skirt 6 inches, you'd see just white fabric underneath, or black, depending on what they chose to use. There is an article by someone from the Oneida Community who does talk about the ways of making the costume and the specific details with it. And she does mention using less yardage if you are making a piece from scratch. And I should delve more into some of the other dress reform documents. I've not done those because I've been focused on the women's rights reformers. But because they are wearing them longer and then going to have to start from scratch, I'm sure that is probably discussed more. Yes.
Do you know of any sort of like agricultural community connections of like people that are farming, for example, that maybe would have, you know, obviously endorsed something like this more? Because I mean, like I have a farm, and obviously like the mud and going out to like milk and stuff is very, I couldn't imagine doing it in a long skirt at all. So do you know, was there anything that women wear differently doing that, or?
Okay, so the question was in agricultural communities about what women are doing, what they're wearing to be practical as they do the dirty work on the farm. I will admit I've not specifically studied what is happening on farms in this period, but I can speak to the fact that in earlier periods, I know in the 18th century in particular, women are finding different ways to deal with this. They are wearing slightly shorter petticoats while they are at work than they might wear if they're going into town. They are hiking up said petticoats if they are really deep into the work that they're doing. So yeah, they're not dressing in that fashionable dragging on the floor length dress while they're doing the hard labor. They would have adopted something a little bit shorter, maybe not as short as what the reformers are wearing, but shorter than normal. And certainly not as many petticoats. You don't need to have the voluminous layers while you're working.
We had a question online, Ashley. How did these white women meet the Haudenosaunee women?
They were living right next door to each other. They were neighbors. I don't know the specifics about how they all got invited into communities, but I can say that Matilda Joslyn Gage specifically had a very close relationship and spent a lot of time in their community talking with them, observing, learning about their lives.
Yeah, I would also just add from the Oneida community perspective, Haudenosaunee women were always here. Oneida women were always here for a variety of different reasons. One, entertainment and sort of being good neighbors. They're often having social functions. employment, and trade. You can see that in the periodicals. You can see it in our best quilt. You can see it in various depictions. So there's definitely a lot of going on here with that. Another question. Were the bloomers similar in construction to the Oneida Community's pantalettes? What can't we see at the top part is the question.
I don't know the answer to that question, and I know of some people that are studying that question and looking into it, but I don't know the answer.
Actually, can I follow up on that? I have a question too. Like, and
Yeah.
it's just so interesting to me that how many different names there are for this kind of thing. And I was just writing down some of the ones you had said, like bloomers, we call them pantalettes, reform dress, American costume, Turkish dress. Is there any difference in those? Do you say, or is it all semantics?
I think it's all semantics. And yes, there are differences in the specific ways that they are constructed. And let me go back. I mentioned the pants, but we didn't actually talk about them. So in this slide, you can see in the two engravings, Amelia Bloomer and then the unnamed woman who she's using to show the Bloomer costume are wearing these pants that are gathered at the bottom. And then in the daguerreotype, she has ones that just end loosely. In the descriptions from the Oneida Community, they talk about pants that are slightly tapered and that also you can tie them together, stitch them together at the bottom if you want to, but not everybody does. So there are these subtle differences, but I think the names are just names.
Another question online from Mary Jo, but I altered a little bit. But did the dress reformers have any information about the Oneida Community's final shoe? Was it the community invented its own kind of shoe to also sort of relieve the painfulness of mid-19th century footwear? But I guess I'm going to kind of expand that question a little bit. Is like, did a lot of these dress reformers expand not just from dresses, but into like accessories and shoe and footwear and things like that too?
Not that I've seen
Okay.
as much, but I know there is. There is an image of a women's rights reformer where her shoes are clearly less reformed than that we're seeing in a lot of the depictions of popular dress and even these depictions of bloomers. They're less dainty in the toes, they have more room. So I've often wondered if that's the case, but I've not seen reference to it.
I have a question, actually. So you, I think you said that Elizabeth Smith Miller, we don't know where she got her inspiration. And you were, okay, so you were making some educated guesses.
Yeah, I mean, those are the places that she could have seen something similar, but no, she never says where she got it. Both the description that Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes about Elizabeth Smith Miller, which she calls her Sabrini Jane in articles in the Lily. She writes about this fictional character, but it's Elizabeth Smith Miller that she's talking about. And then Miller herself also writes about, I decided to do this. I was out in the garden. I was frustrated. I cut off my skirt and I showed it to my husband and he thought it was good. And then I walked to my father's house and he agreed. Like, it just popped into her head based on her explanation. Yes.
I teach history courses at the local city campus. And I know in teaching world history, there's a reference to a British wife of a diplomat, and indeed she served as a diplomat herself, Lady Mary Wortley Montague. And she describes going to a Turkish bathhouse and all the women there feeling really sorry for her as she's stripping off her corset, like, why do they make you wear these things? And I have heard that, just oblique, and this is not my specialty, references to like some knowledge of how women in other parts of the world dressed. And I think about it, I think Montague like wrote that, how published it was and how far it circulated. I don't know. Like she was there in the late 1700s or the 1800s. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
it'd be interesting to explore if there's any information
certainly, I mean, the name Turkish trousers indicates
yeah,
that
yeah,
there is something from that part of the world that has inspired women. And I know that there are examples of girandoles, very fancy candles, candelabras, that show women in Turkish trousers that were popular for the American market. So, you know, how that all ties together, what images women are seeing is an interesting question as well. And I should also mention, that made me think of, not your question, but the issue of corsets. And I mentioned that most women were not tight lacing like we think about, like the torture of corsets. But as you look at the images of women in the bloomer costume, you can get a sense of some who continue to wear corsets and some who choose not to. And it's an interesting personal decision to think about the idea of having worn a corset all your life and suddenly deciding not to have that support. May have been very hard for some women. So some clearly decide to continue to wear it, some decide to go without.
Made me think of this. Was there ever such a thing as maternity bloomers?
I don't know.
Be interesting to know. Any other questions? Thank you, Ganesh.
Thank you.